The sun beat down on the cracked pavement, but it was nothing compared to the cold fire of betrayal burning in Mr. Jonathan's chest. Imagine the person you swore to grow old with, the mother of your newborn children, walking out of your life not because of a lack of love, but because of a lack of money. Imagine her mocking your poverty as she leaves your 1-month-old twin daughters to wail in hunger, trading her family for a life of luxury with a friend who has more to offer. Mr. Jonathan stood in his empty living room, his trembling hands holding Trisha and Natasha tight against his chest. Through the window, he watched his wife, Elizabeth, throw her bags into a waiting car, disappearing into the world of Edith, the woman who had helped dismantle his home. With no milk in the house and no wife by his side, Mr. Jonathan made a silent, desperate vow. His daughters would never know the shame of being too poor again. He didn't just work, he sacrificed. He sold the only home he ever owned, trading the safety of a roof for the weight of medical textbooks. For 20 years, he wore the same tattered, hole-ridden shirt and walked barefoot on the scorching dust of the compound, just to ensure Trish and Natasha could one day walk the halls of a hospital. Now, 2 decades later, the twins stand tall in their pristine white coats, doctors who have mastered the art of healing. But as their mother, Elizabeth, returns not as a queen but as a condemned prisoner framed for murder, these 2 doctors must face their ultimate test. Can they use the medical expertise their father bought with his own blood to save the woman who abandoned them? This is a story of a father's silent endurance, a mother's path to ruin, and the 2 healers who must choose between the bitterness of the past and the mercy of the future. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The sun hung low and oppressive in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the dusty compound of the Jonathan home. Inside the small room, the air was thick with the scent of unwashed clothes and the desperate, thin cries of 1-month-old twins. Mr. Jonathan sat on the edge of a creaky wooden bed, his large, calloused hands trembling as he tried to soothe Trish and Natasha. His stomach groaned with a hunger that had become a constant companion, but his eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for a wife who had been distant for weeks. When Elizabeth finally walked in, she didn't bring food or a mother's comfort. Instead, she brought a heavy suitcase and an aura of cold, sharp detachment. She began pulling her dresses from the wall nails and stuffing them into the bag with a violent efficiency. Mr. Jonathan stood up slowly, the baby still tied to his chest with a faded, tattered wrapper. "Elizabeth, where are you going?" he whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. "The girls are hungry, and there is not even a grain of rice left in the pot." Elizabeth didn't look at him. She merely sneered as she snapped the locks on her suitcase. "I am leaving, Jonathan," she said, her voice dripping with a disdain that cut deeper than any blade. "I was not born to suffer in this cage of poverty while the world passes me by." She turned to face him then, her eyes scanning his worn-out shirt and the tattered state of their one-room apartment. "Look at you," she hissed, pointing a finger at his chest. "You call yourself a man, yet you can't even provide a bottle of milk for these children. I married a provider, not a professional beggar." "We are a family, Elizabeth," Mr. Jonathan pleaded, taking a step toward her, his eyes filling with hot, shameful tears. "Things will get better. I will find work at the construction site. I will do anything." Elizabeth let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the zinc roof. "Better? You've been saying that since the day we wed. While you are busy dreaming of work, Edith is living the life I deserve." She stepped closer, her face inches from his, her expression twisted in a sneer. "Edith showed me what a gold standard life looks like. She has cars, cold wine, and meat in every meal. Why should I stay here and dry up like an old leaf just because you gave me 2 girls?" Mr. Jonathan recoiled as if she had struck him. "You are blaming the children for our poverty? They are innocent, Elizabeth. They are your flesh and blood." But Elizabeth only rolled her eyes and adjusted her head tie. They are a burden I no longer wish to carry. You can keep them. Since you love them so much, let your love buy them bread." She grabbed the handle of her bag and marched toward the door without a single glance at the weeping infants. "Elizabeth, please," he cried out, his voice rising in a desperate roar. "If you leave now, you are leaving us for dead." She stopped at the threshold, the bright afternoon sun silhouetting her frame. She looked back over her shoulder, her lips curling into a final wicked smile. "Then I suppose you should start praying, Jonathan. Maybe your God will send you manna, because I am done being your cook and your servant in this hole. I am a queen, and I am going to find my throne." With a final decisive step, she walked out into the heat, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Mr. Jonathan stood frozen, the twins' cries reaching a fever pitch as if they understood the magnitude of the desertion. He walked to the doorway and watched her climb into a waiting car driven by Edith, the woman who had helped dismantle his life. As the car drove off, kicking up a cloud of red dust, the silence that followed was heavier than the hunger in his gut. He looked down at Trish and Natasha, their tiny faces red from crying, and he felt a shift deep within his soul. The man who had walked into the room was broken, but the man standing in the dust was reborn with a singular, iron-willed purpose. He wiped his tears with the back of a rough hand and whispered into the quiet room, "I will give you the life she was too blind to see. Even if I have to sell my soul, you will be great." The sun was a relentless furnace, baking the red dust of the streets as Mr. Jonathan made his way toward the gated villa of Madame Peace. It had been 5 years since Elizabeth had walked out, leaving him with nothing but 2 hungry mouths to feed and a heart that felt like a hollowed-out shell. Trish and Natasha were 5 years old now, brilliant, curious, and already showing a sharp intelligence that made Mr. Jonathan's chest swell with a mix of pride and terror. He had managed to keep them fed by washing clothes and hauling heavy loads at the market, but the time for school had arrived, and his meager savings were like a handful of sand against a rising tide. He adjusted his tattered shirt, the fabric so thin it felt like a second skin, and smoothed his hair as he stood before the imposing iron gates. Madame Peace was a woman of legendary wealth in their neighborhood, known for her connections and her charity, though the whispers in the market suggested her help always came with a hidden hook. As the gates groaned open, Mr. Jonathan felt a shiver of apprehension. The villa was a monument to the life Elizabeth had craved: tall pillars, manicured gardens, and an air of expensive perfume that masked the smell of the dusty street outside. Madame Peace sat on a plush velvet throne in her living room, her fingers weighted with gold rings that caught the afternoon light. She didn't rise when he entered. Instead, she let her eyes travel slowly from his calloused bare feet to his sunken cheeks, a thin smile playing on her lips. "Ah, the father of the year," she drawled, her voice like honey poured over gravel. "What brings a man of such great pride to my humble palace?" Mr. Jonathan cleared his throat, his cap held tightly in his hands. "Madam, my daughters are ready for school. They are smart, Ma. Very smart. I want to give them the education their mother thought was impossible for our kind. I have saved, but I am still short. I came to ask for a loan. I will work. I will pay back every kobo with interest." Madame Peace leaned forward, the gold on her neck clinking softly. She let out a dry, mocking laugh that echoed against the high ceilings. "Education? For girls?" she asked, her eyebrows arching in disbelief. "Jonathan, you are a dreamer. Train a female child, and she will only end up in another man's kitchen, wasting all the money you bled for. Why suffer for a certificate that will end up as a wrapper for groundnuts?" "Not my daughters, Ma," Mr. Jonathan replied, his voice low but steady. "They will be healers. They will be doctors. They belong at the top, and I will be the ladder they climb." The room went silent. Madame Peace licked her lips, her eyes narrowing as she shifted her gaze. "I admire your stubbornness, Jonathan. It is attractive in a man who has so little. I will give you the money. In fact, I will give you enough to move out of that shack and dress like a human being again." Mr. Jonathan's heart leaped with a sudden, dangerous hope. "Thank you, madam. God will bless." "Wait," she interrupted, raising a ringed hand. "I do not give such sums for free. You have no collateral, no house, no land. But you are a strong man, fine-featured, despite the hunger. My husband is often away on business, and a woman like me gets lonely in such a big house. Come and stay here. Be my assistant by night, and your daughters will never lack for anything again." The air in the room suddenly felt heavy and foul. Mr. Jonathan realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't offering a loan. She was offering a transaction for his soul. She wanted him to give up the very dignity he was trying to teach his daughters to possess. "Madam," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and fury, "I thought you were a person of virtue. You want to take advantage of a father's desperation." Madame Peace stood up, her silk gown rustling. "Don't be a fool, Jonathan. Think of the girls. Do you want them to study in the dirt, or do you want them to have the world? One night of work for me is worth a year of your labor in the market." Mr. Jonathan stood tall, his tattered shirt a badge of honor compared to the gold she wore. "My daughters will walk to school with no shoes before they see their father sell himself for their fees. If I lose my pride, I have nothing to give them but money, and money is a poor substitute for a father's character." He turned and walked toward the door, her laughter following him like a curse. "You will be back, beggar," she hissed. "Hunger is a better teacher than I am." But Mr. Jonathan didn't look back. As he stepped back into the burning sun, his pockets were empty, but his spirit was forged in iron. He would find another way, even if it meant giving up the last piece of land his father had left him. The dusty heat of the afternoon seemed to press against the walls of the small house, a home that had once echoed with the quiet dreams of a young family, but now felt like a hollow shell. Mr. Jonathan stood in the center of the living room, his fingers tracing the deep cracks in the plaster where he had once measured the girls' heights. He looked down at Trish and Natasha, now 5 years old, their eyes wide and innocent as they clutched at his tattered trousers. They didn't understand why the strange man with the dirty notebook was kicking at the floor tiles, or why their father's face looked like a mask of carved stone. Every corner of this building held a memory, the spot where Elizabeth had first held them before the bitterness took her, and the threshold where she had eventually walked out, leaving them to the wolves of poverty. The buyer, a man with a cold, calculating gaze, shook his head as he inspected the leaking zinc roof. He spoke of the house as if it were a pile of refuse, noting the weak walls and the toilet that no longer functioned. He was buying it only for the land, a fact he made sure Mr. Jonathan understood to drive the price into the dirt. Mr. Jonathan simply nodded, his jaw tight. He knew the house was falling apart, but it was the only inheritance he had from his own father, the only thing that stood between his daughters and the harsh unpredictability of the streets. Yet, as he looked at the girls, he didn't see a crumbling building. He saw 2 future doctors who needed a foundation that bricks and mortar could never provide. When the man finally handed over a thick brown envelope, the weight of it felt like lead in Mr. Jonathan's palm. He didn't count the money. He couldn't bring himself to quantify the loss of his legacy. In that moment, he became a man without a home, but as he looked at the envelope, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was a grim, unyielding hope. He knew exactly where that money was going. It wasn't for a better bed or a new suit to replace his rags. It was for the heavy, leather-bound medical volumes and the tuition fees that would ensure his daughters would never have to beg for a roof again. The transition was brutal. By nightfall, they had moved their few belongings, a couple of old wrappers, a few plastic bowls, and a stack of notebooks, into an abandoned, uncompleted building tucked away behind the chaos of the local market. There were no windows to keep out the mosquitoes, no doors to bar the cold night air, and the floor was nothing but jagged gray concrete and dust. They used old faded curtains to create a makeshift bed on the floor, and broken pieces of timber served as their only chairs. When the tropical rains began to drum against the unfinished concrete, Mr. Jonathan would sit awake, holding plastic bowls to catch the leaks so the water wouldn't ruin the girls' precious books. He took on every demeaning job the market offered to keep them afloat, washing blood from the floors of the butchery and hauling heavy crates of produce until his back felt like it would snap. He would come home with bruises on his shins and hands that were permanently stained with grime, his tattered shirt hanging off his thinning frame. Often, his own stomach would growl with a hollow, painful ache, but he would watch with a quiet, tired smile as Trish and Natasha shared a small bowl of soaked Gary. He told them it was a feast, whispering to them as they drifted to sleep that they were not defined by the gray blocks surrounding them, but by the knowledge growing in their minds. He was trading his dignity, his comfort, and his very skin to ensure they had the gold standard education their mother had claimed they would never see. Standing in the shadows of that shack, Mr. Jonathan realized he had lost a house, but he was building a future that no one could ever take away. The sky over the market square turned a bruised shade of purple before finally rupturing into a torrential downpour. For Mr. Jonathan, the rain was not a blessing for the crops. It was a thief that stole the little warmth left in their makeshift home. They were living in a skeletal structure, an abandoned building with no doors or windows, where the walls were nothing but cold cement blocks and the floor was jagged, broken concrete. As the wind howled through the empty frames, spray from the rain soaked the old curtains they used as bed sheets. In the corner, huddled together on a piece of warped plywood that served as their desk, Trish and Natasha were bent over a single flickering candle. The twins were barely 10 years old, yet their faces bore the heavy lines of concentration usually reserved for adults. Their school uniforms were damp and frayed at the edges, but their focus was unbreakable. Tresha shielded the candle flame with her small trembling hand, preventing the wind from plunging them into darkness, while Natasha traced the diagrams in a borrowed medical encyclopedia with a diligent finger. They were studying the human heart, a subject that felt ironically distant in a world that had treated their father with such coldness. Mr. Jonathan sat nearby, his body aching from a day of hauling heavy crates of produce for traders. His hands were calloused and his back felt as though it might snap, but he remained silent, watching his daughters with a mixture of pride and agonizing guilt. He had sold his inheritance, his very roof, to ensure their school fees were paid, and yet here they were, shivering in a ruin. Every time a thunderclap shook the building, he saw them flinch, yet they never once asked to stop studying. They knew the cost of those books. They knew their father was trading his health for their education. Outside, an elderly woman named Mama Josephine struggled through the mud, her basket of oranges covered with a tattered plastic sheet. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had watched the man with the twins move into the skeleton house with nothing but a small bag of clothes. She stopped by the open doorway, her breath catching as she witnessed the scene inside. The sight of the two young girls, their feet dusty and wet, reading about medicine by the light of a dying candle in a flooded room, moved something deep within her soul. "My son," she called out, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the zinc sheets. Mr. Jonathan startled, rising quickly to shield his daughters from the unknown visitor. He saw the old woman dripping with water, her eyes soft and filled with an unexpected kindness. "It is not safe here," she said, gesturing to a wall that looked as though it might crumble under the weight of the storm. "The dampness will enter their lungs before they ever get the chance to become the healers they are studying to be." Mr. Jonathan lowered his guard, his voice raspy from exhaustion. "It is all we have, Ma," he replied, the same words he had told his heart every night for years. Mama Josephine stepped closer, ignoring the puddles forming around her feet. "I live in a 3-bedroom house just 2 streets away," she said firmly. "It is too big for a widow and her memories. Come and stay with me. You do not have to pay a single kobo. Stay as long as it takes for these girls to finish their journey." Mr. Jonathan froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Trish and Natasha, who had stopped reading to look at the woman with wide, hopeful eyes. For years, he had faced nothing but mockery from men like Mr. Johnson and betrayal from his own wife, Elizabeth. He had forgotten that the world could still hold grace. He dropped to his knees on the cold concrete, the tears he had held back for years finally merging with the rainwater on his face. "God bless you, Ma," he whispered, his voice breaking. "May the heavens reward you for seeing us." That night, for the first time in years, the twins did not study by candlelight. They sat in a real kitchen, eating a warm meal provided by a stranger who had become a grandmother. As Mr. Jonathan watched them sleep in a dry bed, he realized that while he had sold his house to give them a future, it was the kindness of a stranger that had given them a home. The fire in his chest, once fueled by the anger of Elizabeth's betrayal, began to turn into a steady flame of hope. The sun was a golden orb hanging over the university auditorium, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the 2 decades of toil Mr. Jonathan had endured. 20 years had passed since the day Elizabeth walked out, leaving him with 2 screaming infants and a heart full of holes. Today, those holes were finally being filled, not with bricks and mortar, but with the sight of his daughters in their pristine white coats. Mr. Jonathan stood at the very back of the hall, leaning against a cold marble pillar. He was a stark contrast to the opulence around him. His shirt was thin and tattered, with visible holes that whispered of years spent scrubbing floors and hauling cement. His feet, calloused and bare against the polished floor, bore the dust of the long walk he had taken to get here, having saved every last kobo for the girls' celebration rather than a bus fare. He looked older than his years, his hair a shock of white and his frame bent like a tree that had survived too many storms, but his eyes were bright with a fire that no poverty could extinguish. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the hum of proud families, but Mr. Jonathan heard only the rhythmic thumping of his own heart. He remembered the nights in the uncompleted building, the girls huddled under a single wrapper, studying by the flickering light of a stolen candle while the rain dripped through the zinc roof. He remembered the hunger that gnawed at his stomach so they could have an extra pencil or a used anatomy textbook. Every drop of sweat he had shed in the sun was a seed planted in the fertile ground of their minds. The dean stepped onto the podium, her voice booming through the speakers as she began the roll call of the graduating surgeons. When the names Trish Jonathan and Natasha Jonathan were called, the applause was thunderous. They were the top of their class, the miracle twins who had conquered the most difficult curriculum the university had to offer. As they walked across the stage, their white coats gleaming like armor, Mr. Jonathan felt a sob rise in his throat. Trish moved with a grace that reminded him of her mother, but with a strength that was entirely her own. Natasha followed, her eyes scanning the crowd with the sharp, clinical focus of a woman who knew exactly what it cost to be there. They looked like queens of a kingdom they had built with their own hands. From the stage, the twins' eyes moved past the wealthy parents in the front rows, past the dignitaries and the professors, searching for the one person who mattered. When they spotted the thin, ragged man leaning against the pillar at the back, their faces transformed. Their professional masks melted into smiles of pure, unadulterated joy. Trish raised her stethoscope in a silent salute, while Natasha blew a kiss that traveled across the room like a prayer. Mr. Jonathan didn't care that the people around him were whispering about his appearance or that security looked at him with suspicion. He stood as tall as his tired bones would allow. He was the man who had traded his inheritance for their intellect. He was the man who had sold his roof to give them the sky. As the ceremony ended and the crowd began to pour out into the garden, Trish and Natasha didn't wait for the dignitaries to finish their speeches. They descended the stairs and ran through the crowd, their white coats fluttering behind them like wings. They reached him at the back of the hall, ignoring the dirt on his clothes and the smell of hard labor that clung to his skin. They threw their arms around him, a sea of white fabric enveloping his tattered frame. "We did it, Papa," Trish whispered into his ear, her tears wetting his shoulder. "We are doctors now," Natasha added, holding his rough, calloused hand against her cheek. Mr. Jonathan could only nod, his voice lost to the overwhelming tide of pride. He looked at the massive university buildings and then back at his daughters, realizing that while he had once lost a house of stone, he had gained a legacy that would live forever. The golden luster of the life Elizabeth had traded her family for had long since tarnished, leaving behind only the cold, hard weight of regret. 20 years had passed since she walked away from the wailing cries of Treshan Natasha, yet the echoes of those cries seemed to haunt the quiet, lonely corners of Edith's sprawling mansion. In the beginning, the promise of silk sheets and expensive wine had blinded her, but time had revealed a bitter truth. She hadn't been invited into Edith's home as a friend, but as a trophy of Edith's superiority. Elizabeth had become a glorified servant, a shadow moving through the halls of a house that would never be her own. On this particular evening, the humidity hung heavy in the air, mirroring the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. Elizabeth stood by the mahogany sideboard, her hands, once soft, now roughened by the domestic chores Edith demanded, trembling as she poured a glass of chilled wine for her benefactor. Edith sat at the head of the table, draped in jewels that caught the light, her eyes cold as she watched Elizabeth's every move. "You're slow today, Elizabeth," Edith remarked, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that had become the soundtrack of Elizabeth's life. "Perhaps the years of leisure I've gifted you have made you soft. Don't forget who rescued you from that hovel and that pathetic man." Elizabeth swallowed the lump in her throat, her mind flashing back to Mr. Jonathan. She remembered the way he used to look at her, not with the condescension of a master, but with a deep, abiding love that saw her as a queen even when they had nothing. She thought of the tattered shirt he wore in the image of her memories, his chest bare and his skin weathered by the sun, yet his spirit remained unbroken as he labored to give their daughters a life she had been too impatient to wait for. She realized, with a stinging clarity, that while Mr. Jonathan had traded his house for their daughter's future, she had traded her soul for a cage made of gold. "I am grateful, Edith," Elizabeth whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She moved to the window, looking out toward the distant lights of the city. Somewhere out there, the daughters she had abandoned were now women. Doctors, healers, the very white-coated symbols of success she once thought were impossible for children of a poor man. She had seen their names in the newspapers: Treshan Natasha Jonathan, top of their class, brilliant and beautiful. A wave of shame washed over her as she looked at her own reflection in the darkened glass. She saw a woman who had aged prematurely, her eyes hollowed by the realization that she had chosen a counterfeit life. The realization of her mistake was a physical pain, a dull ache in her chest that never truly subsided. She had called Mr. Jonathan a poor man as she walked out the door, mocking his inability to provide the luxury she craved. But looking around Edith's cold, sterile mansion, she understood that Mr. Jonathan was the richest man she had ever known. He possessed a wealth of character and a capacity for sacrifice that she couldn't even fathom. He had stayed when it was hard. He had built a legacy from the dust while she had only succeeded in becoming a footnote in another woman's story. As Edith laughed at a joke on her phone, ignoring Elizabeth entirely, the ashes of betrayal felt thick in the air. Elizabeth had burned her bridges to reach this shore, only to find the land barren. She was alone, trapped in a cycle of servitude to a woman who viewed her as an ornament of her own wealth. The value of the man she left was no longer a question, it was a haunting certainty. She had traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and as the night deepened, Elizabeth finally accepted that some debts of the heart can never be repaid, and some bridges, once burned, leave you stranded in the dark forever. The golden chandelier in Edith's penthouse swayed slightly as the shouting intensified, casting jagged shadows across the marble floor. Chief Roland stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, his face contorted in a mask of fury that made his expensive gold chains rattle against his chest. Across from him, Edith paced like a caged leopard, her voice shrill with a desperation she had tried to hide for years. She was no longer the confident woman who had lured Elizabeth away from her family 2 decades ago. She was a woman caught in the web of a man far more dangerous than she had anticipated. "You promised me the offshore accounts would be in my name, Roland." Edith screamed, her hands trembling as she pointed a manicured finger at the tycoon. "I have done everything for you. I have lied, I have cheated, and I have kept your secrets. You cannot just discard me now." Chief Roland didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a low, guttural laugh that chilled the air in the heated room. He saw Edith not as a partner, but as a liability that had outlived its usefulness. He moved toward her with a predatory slowness, his shadow looming over the expensive Persian rug. "You are becoming loud, Edith," Roland whispered, his voice dangerously calm. "And loud women are a threat to my business." The argument escalated into a flurry of motion. Edith reached for a heavy crystal decanter on the side table, perhaps intending to defend herself or simply to strike out in rage, but Roland was faster. He lunged forward, his powerful hands gripping her shoulders with bone-crushing force. In the struggle that followed, the sounds of scuffling feet and labored breathing filled the room. Roland shoved her with a violent, unrestrained burst of strength. Edith's silk heels lost their grip on the polished floor, and she fell backward, her head striking the sharp edge of the marble fireplace with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Roland stood over her, watching as the light faded from her eyes, his own heartbeat steady and cold. He didn't feel remorse. He felt a calculated need for survival. He looked around the room, his mind already weaving a web that would trap an innocent soul in his place. His gaze fell upon a half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table, the glass Elizabeth had been drinking from just an hour before she had retired to the guest wing after another one of their bitter disagreements. Elizabeth had become a shadow in this house, a glorified servant who lived on Edith's crumbs, and Roland knew she was the perfect sacrificial lamb. With clinical precision, he pulled a pair of fine leather gloves from his pocket. He picked up the crystal decanter Edith had reached for, ensuring his own prints were never left behind, and carefully pressed Elizabeth's discarded wine glass against the smooth surface. He moved through the penthouse like a ghost, planting evidence that suggested a violent struggle between two jealous, aging friends. He knocked over a chair, scattered some of Edith's jewelry near the doorway of the guest wing, and finally, he used his influence to call a high-ranking officer on his private line. "There has been a tragedy," Roland said into the phone, his voice now trembling with a practiced, fraudulent grief. "I came to visit Edith and found her. I think Elizabeth finally snapped. She's been so unstable lately, complaining about money and the past. You must get here before she flees." By the time the police sirens began to wail in the distance, the trap was set. Elizabeth, who was fast asleep and dreaming of the daughters she had abandoned 20 years ago, had no idea that her world was about to end. Chief Roland stood in the shadows of the hallway, a cruel smile touching his lips as he watched the law he had bought and paid for prepare to destroy the woman who had already lost everything but her life. The sterile metallic scent of the prison ward was a far cry from a high-end private hospitals where Dr. Tresh and Dr. Natasha usually performed their rounds. As the heavy iron door creaked open, the twins stood side by side in their crisp white coats, their stethoscopes resting like heavy weights around their necks. On the narrow, stained cot lay a woman who looked twice her age, her skin sallow and her breathing labored. This was Elizabeth, the woman who had traded her newborn daughters for a life of luxury with Edith, now reduced to a sickly prisoner awaiting a death sentence for a crime she claimed she did not commit. For a long moment, the only sound was the rhythmic wheezing of Elizabeth's lungs. Tresha felt a cold lump in her throat, remembering the stories their father, Mr. Jonathan, had finally shared, stories of hunger, of a tattered wrapper, and of the day he was told he was not enough. Elizabeth's eyes flickered open, widening in shock as she took in the two successful women standing before her. She tried to sit up, but a coughing fit racked her thin frame, leaving her gasping for air. "Trisha? Natasha," she whispered, her voice a ghost of the sharp, mocking tone she had used 20 years ago when she walked out the door. "You came." "We didn't come as your daughters," Natasha said, her voice clinical and devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for her patients. "We came as medical professionals to review your case. The state has provided us with your health records and the autopsy report of Edith." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears that spilled over her sunken cheeks. "I didn't do it," she sobbed, her hands trembling against the thin prison blanket. "Chief Rowland, he was the one. He and Edith were arguing about money. He pushed her, and she hit her head. He told the police I did it because I was jealous of her wealth. No one believed me because I am nothing now." Tresha pulled a tablet from her bag, displaying the digital copy of the autopsy report they had spent all night analyzing. The original report states that Edith died from a blunt force trauma to the occipital bone, caused by a fall. It claims the time of death was 4 p.m., a time when neighbors saw you entering the house. Natasha leaned in, her medical intuition sharpening. "But we noticed something in the toxicology and the rigor mortis progression noted by the initial examiner. The body temperature and the chemical breakdown in her system suggest a much earlier time of death, likely closer to 1 p.m. At 1 p.m., you were at the market cleaning stalls, weren't you?" Elizabeth nodded vigorously. "Yes. The market women saw me. But Chief Rowland told the police the cameras were broken." The twins exchanged a look of grim determination. They looked at the woman who had abandoned them, seeing not a mother, but a victim of a powerful man's corruption. The pain of their father's sacrifice, the years he spent in tattered clothes and barefoot so they could study these very reports, surged through them. "We are going to request a formal re-examination of the forensic evidence," Trisha stated, her voice echoing with the authority of her medical standing. "If the time of death is medically proven to be earlier, Chief Rowland's testimony falls apart. We will use our status to ensure the court doesn't ignore the science this time." Elizabeth reached out a frail hand, but Natasha stepped back slightly, maintaining the professional distance that protected her heart. "Don't thank us," Natasha said quietly. "We are doing this because our father taught us that justice is a debt everyone is owed, even those who didn't give it to others. We are doctors, Elizabeth. We don't let people die for mistakes they didn't commit." As they turned to leave the cell, the image of their father standing in the dust of their compound, his shirt in rags but his head held high, flashed in their minds. They walked out of the prison ward not just as daughters, but as the guardians of a truth that had been buried for too long. The fluorescent lights of the High Court hummed with an oppressive energy as Dr. Tresha and Dr. Natasha sat in the front row, their white coats a stark contrast to the dark wooden benches of the courtroom. Behind them their father, Mr. Jonathan, sat with his head bowed, his tattered shirt a painful reminder of the 20 years he had spent in the trenches of poverty to put them where they were today. Across the aisle, Chief Rowland sat with an air of arrogant indifference, his expensive suit shimmering under the lights, confident that his wealth had successfully buried the truth of Edith's death. He had manipulated the police and silenced the witnesses, but he had not accounted for the scientific precision of two daughters determined to save their family legacy. The prosecution had already painted a damning picture of Elizabeth, claiming she had killed Edith in a fit of jealous rage. When the twins stood to present their findings, the room fell into a heavy silence. They didn't just speak as daughters, they spoke as medical professionals. Natasha approached the witness stand, her voice steady and clinical as she presented the re-evaluated autopsy report. She pointed to the physiological markers of rigor mortis and body temperature that the initial investigators had conveniently overlooked. Based on the metabolic rate and environmental factors of the crime scene, the time of death was exactly 4:15 p.m., Natasha stated, her eyes locking onto Chief Rowland. "At that exact moment, my mother was documented at a local pharmacy, miles away from the scene. But the medical evidence was only the first blow." Tresha stepped forward, holding a digital tablet connected to the court's projector. "Science tells us when she died, but this witness tells us who was there," she said firmly. On the screen, a grainy but undeniable video began to play. It was the footage recovered from the retired teacher, Mr. Phillip, whose security camera had been the silent watcher of that fateful afternoon. The courtroom gasped as the video showed Chief Rowland's luxury vehicle pulling up to Edith's gate. The timestamp on the video matched the medical time of death perfectly. The footage showed the chief entering the house and less than an hour later, sprinting back to his car, looking panicked and disheveled as he sped away. Chief Rowland's lawyer attempted to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. The medical timeline and the visual proof acted as a pincer, trapping the tycoon in his own web of lies. The judge leaned forward, his face etched with gravity as he watched the chief's composure crumble. Within hours, the narrative shifted from Elizabeth's guilt to the chief's corruption. The verdict was swift and merciless. Chief Rowland was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Edith and the malicious framing of an innocent woman. As the handcuffs clicked around the chief's wrists, Elizabeth broke down in the dock, weeping with a mixture of shame and relief. She looked toward Mr. Jonathan, her eyes pleading for a forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. Mr. Jonathan stood up slowly, his body weary from decades of labor, and simply nodded. He had kept his promise. His daughters were not just doctors, they were the bringers of justice. A few weeks later, the dust of the courtroom had settled, and the twins led their father to a quiet, upscale neighborhood. They stopped in front of a sprawling white mansion with grand pillars and a lush garden that mirrored the beauty of the life they had finally secured. "What are we doing here, my darlings?" Mr. Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. Tresha placed a set of gold keys into his calloused palm, while Natasha wrapped her arm around his frail shoulders. "You sold your roof so we could have a future," Tresha whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Now we have bought you a palace, so you never have to worry about the rain again." Mr. Jonathan looked at the keys, then at his daughters standing proudly in their white coats, and finally at the magnificent house. For the first time in 20 years, the fire in his chest wasn't from hunger or betrayal. It was the warmth of a debt finally repaid by the love of the children he had refused to give up on.